My name is Jean Ann Wright, and I'm the designer of the Pineapple Trim Tool for Creative Grids. This tool shows you how to make a perfect pineapple block every time, and it has the wonderful Creative Grid non-skid markings on it so that as you trim, it will stay in place. Now the pineapple block is a little more challenging because you start with a square and you work into an 8-sided block. So I'm going to show you how you do that. The first thing you do is cut 2.5 center squares for your block. These need to be cut precisely. Once you've cut them, your precision cutting is done. You can add strips of any width, leftover binding, strips from other projects, or if I have to cut strips, I cut them 1 3/4 inches wide. So now I've added 1 strip to each side of my center square. And you see it only has to go beyond the square. It doesn't have to go all the way out to the edges. So when I've done that, I'm ready to trim. So what I do is I take my centering square on my trim tool, and because I'm trimming the light colored strips, I'm going to use the white markings on the ruler. So I put that white square right over my center square, and then I'm going to trim each side of this piece one at a time. And when it is all trimmed, all 4 sides, here's what I end up with. So next I'm going to put my dark pieces onto my pineapple block. And when I do that, I'm going to turn, since I'm trimming dark strips, and use the dark strips on my pineapple trim tool. So I'm going to put that dark square right over my center square, and I'm going to trim each side one at a time. And you'll notice as I progress that I'm always trimming from the center out. So here's what I get after I have trimmed the second square, and it is perfectly sized. Now I have to trim another set of light strips that I have sewed in place. But this time I'm going to abandon my white square, and instead I'm going to use the white angle trim line to put it on my seam line, and then I'm going to use these dotted lines just as a squaring up guide. So I put this white line right on my seam line, line up my dotted lines, and trim each side one side at a time. When I'm all trimmed, I'm going to end up this. You'll notice that each time I trim, I'm sizing it perfectly, working from the center out. I'm going to add another row of dark, and when I add that row of dark, I'm going to turn my ruler and use the dark markings to trim the dark strips. So I'm going to trim each side all the way around, and now this is what I have. Now if I want to, I'm working my way up into a 6-inch block to begin with. So I'm going to add 1 more row of strips. These are dark again. And I'm going to trim them. When they're done, I'm going to trim them 2 ways. First, I'm going to trim them around like this. And get this. And then I'm going to trim them down a little bit. And then I'm going to add my corner squares. And when I do that, I'm going to end up with this, and this will be perfectly sized. And it's a completed 6-inch pineapple block. Now my next thing is I want to make an 8-inch block, because this ruler makes 3 sizes of blocks, 6, 8, and 10-inch. So once again, I add my dark strips. I trim the dark strips down, and then I add my dark corners, and then I trim out and make my 8-inch block. But if I want to go all the way up to a 10-inch block, here's my completed 8-inch block. If I want to go all the way up to a 10-inch block, I'm going to add another row of light strips and another row of dark strips, trimming each row as I go, and then when I'm out here, I'll once again trim this down to 1 1/4 inches so that my block will be perfectly squared. And this is what it will look like. And I add my corner squares, and then I use my ruler and the center square, and I trim it out perfectly to get a perfect 10-inch block. So depending on when you start and when you stop, you can make a 6, 8, or 10-inch pineapple block. I've made a number of quilts using this ruler. The one behind me has 10-inch blocks, And this quilt has 6-inch blocks, and I have a table runner with 10-inch blocks as well. And we have a variety of cut loose patterns that you can use with the ruler. And this is the table runner. Here's a 10-inch block and an 8, other 8s and 6. So you can buy patterns to go with your rulers and make a perfect pineapple quilt every single time. You can find these cut loose patterns at your local quilt stores, and if they don't have them, you can ask them to order them from Checker Distributors.